This week, anger in Texas as millions sat in the dark with no heat amid the failure of the Texas power grid. Texas was an icebox this week with temperatures in the teens felt in southern Texas and areas like Houston. Areas that see little or no snow every year were now covered with snow and ice. And there's new outrage this week with Texas Senator Ted Cruz as he escaped to Cancun with his family while millions were suffering in his own state. The snowstorm caused problems with the race to vaccinate as well, with clinics in Texas and across the US being temporarily shut down. This as the UK and South African strain continue to spread across the country. There was also major news last weekend with former President Donald Trump being acquitted by a vote of 57 to 43, and major international headlines in Myanmar and Japan. And finally this week, some hope, as Perseverance successfully landed on Mars. Good afternoon, and it's great to have you with us at the end of this long and tumultuous week for so many across the United States. Millions were hit by this massive snowstorm that had devastating effects on the state of Texas. Millions of Texans lost power and water this week, having to boil snow in some cases in order to flush the toilets, and either wrapping themselves in blankets or attempting to escape to warming shelters, such as Mattress Max Gallery Furniture. Even Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner had a power outage during a press conference. And here's a striking image from Bel Air, Texas on Monday with snow covering the streets as far as the eye can see. And in Galveston, Texas this week, the sandy beaches were covered in white snow. And as the power began to return, another crisis was emerging, with a boil water notice across the Houston area that could potentially last through the weekend. A new outrage from Texans over the power grid, with many wondering, why was Texas so inadequately prepared for the cold? We will carefully guide you through all the headlines this week, and we begin with the search for answers in the failure of Texas's power grid. The impacts of the snowstorm have Texans wondering why the power grid failed so completely. Texas Governor Greg Abbott placed the blame on ERCOT, the nonprofit that manages the Texas power grid, and has called for a full investigation into them. Texas is the only state in the United States to have its own power grid, the rest either on an eastern power grid or a western power grid. And it's clear that in Texas there was a complete failure to winterize, with new reports suggesting that there was a warning 10 years ago that the system was not prepared for the winter. There has also been discussion about whether or not renewable energy was to blame, but based on the numbers, fossil fuel and renewable energy appear to fail at the same rate relative to the proportion of power they generate in Texas. And it's hard to believe that this could get any worse, but the CEO of ERCOT said that we were, quote, minutes and seconds, end quote, away from a total blackout of the Texas system. And as a result, forced blackouts across the state, with some not having power for days at a time, struggling without light and without heat. Next, we turn to our weather correspondent, Phoebe Cosgrove, who discusses the impacts of the storm.
Severe weather is affecting more than 100 million Americans. While power has been restored to millions in Texas, nearly 13 million still don't have access to clean, running water. In Houston, there are long lines for gas, food, and supplies. Things are also bad in Oklahoma, where President Biden declared a state of emergency.
Thank you, Phoebe. There was one image in particular that was creating a lot of outrage Thursday morning: Ted Cruz on a plane to Cancun, while people in Texas were suffering in the cold. For details on this, we turn to JSA's Abby Count.
Amidst the crisis that has left millions of Texans without safe drinking water, warm homes, or power, Republicans Texas Senator Ted Cruz attempted to escape the cold for a beach getaway in Cancun, Mexico. Photos immediately began surfacing of Cruz at the Cancun airport gate, which started a social media frenzy, with hashtags like "Thanks for Nothing Senator" and "Cancun Cruz," claiming the senator deserted his home state during a time of crisis. The initial public reaction was one of disbelief, but the pictures and other surfacing evidence did not lie, and Cruz issued a statement claiming he immediately regretted the trip once he got on the plane and planned to come straight home. He also included that they originally booked the trip because his teenage daughters wanted to go on the trip and he was just trying to be a good father. When asked about the trip upon his return, Cruz admitted, "Look, it was obviously a mistake. In hindsight, I wouldn't have done it. I was trying to be a good dad." We'll keep you updated with more developments on this story. Max?
Thank you, Abby. As this storm left millions without power and the roads were covered in ice, there was another impact too. The COVID-19 vaccination appointments canceled as a result of this storm. This as cases and hospitalizations were beginning to decline rapidly across the country. Here's Dylan Canfield.
Beyond the tragic power and water issues associated with the storm, there are also concerns with the vaccination effort. Across all of Texas and much of the U.S., vaccination appointments were canceled this week as a result of the storm, delaying the effort to vaccinate Americans. This comes as there are now 7 new strains of the COVID-19 virus, called U.S. strains, that could prove to be more contagious, and as the UK and South African strains both continue to spread across the U.S. The Biden administration has announced that they will be upping the weekly vaccine supply to 13.5 million in an effort to ensure all Americans will have access to the vaccine by early summer. Fauci and Biden both said that they expect normalcy by the winter holidays.
Thank you, Dylan. We turn next overseas to the international headlines, and for that, we go to JSA's international correspondent, Vicky Kai.
We begin today with a story out of Japan, where over the weekend, a 7.1 magnitude earthquake occurred about 40 miles off the coast of Fukushima Prefecture. The quake, which has already triggered numerous aftershocks, could be felt as far south as Tokyo, nearly 200 miles away. Thankfully, no fatalities have been reported from Saturday's seismic event. This earthquake occurred just weeks before the 10-year anniversary of the devastating 2011 Tohoku earthquake, and has been classified by some to be an aftershock of that earthquake which caused the deaths of almost 16,000 people and triggered the devastating meltdown of a nuclear power plant. In other news, in a continuing display of unrest in Myanmar, a secret trial was held for former leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who has been accused of the new military government of violating import restrictions as well as attending public gatherings during the pandemic. If convicted, she faces up to 6 years in jail. And Argentina's former president, Carlos Saúl Menem, has passed away at age 90. Menem led the country from 1989 to 1999 during a highly tumultuous time for the nation's economy. That's our weekly international news rundown. Max?
Thank you, Vicky. While this week alone has felt like a year for those in Texas, just 6 days ago, former President Trump was acquitted on the charge of incitement of insurrection at the U.S. Capitol. Here's JSA's Ethan Canfield with the details.
This past Saturday, former President Trump was acquitted on the charge of incitement of insurrection by a vote of 57 guilty to 43 not guilty. 7 Republican senators voted with the Democrats to convict, making this the most bipartisan impeachment in U.S. history. After the vote, Mitch McConnell gave a speech in which he said that the case could move into the criminal courts and that Trump was morally responsible for the January attack on the Capitol. Democrats were outraged that McConnell gave this speech while also acquitting, but McConnell argued that the trial was unconstitutional and that's why he voted to acquit. After learning of his acquittal, Trump released a statement calling his second impeachment a witch hunt and hinted at a political return.
Thank you, Ethan. And finally today, some hope. As people in Texas have been showing their perseverance this week, there was another sign of perseverance almost 130 million miles away. Here's JSA's STEM correspondent, Danny Vargas.
The NASA rover Perseverance has landed on Mars after a 6.5-month journey. Perseverance is part of NASA's continuing effort to investigate Mars for signs of life. It carries various scientific instruments, including tools to dig into the Martian soil, and a helicopter called Ingenuity.
And Perseverance has already begun sending images back to Earth. Thank you, Danny. And that's this week's JSA Update. From all of us here at JSA, I'm Max Rothman. We'll be right back here next week. Have a great day.